packet, you're going to see a little map up at the top so that you can get a general idea of some of these places that we're talking about. Gath, which is where Goliath is from. Remember that the Philistines had 5 major cities that they mostly stayed in and were in control of, Gath being one of them. And so you can kind of see some of the area. Here's the Valley of Elah, which is where the battle took place. The Valley of Elah is still in Israel today. It's still a place where you can go out and look upon. We actually went there when I was with Dr. Fruchtenbaum's tour, and you can go out there and it's really common. Oh, I should have brought them out. I have a little bag of them. They encourage you to go out and pick up 5 stones from the ground there, and you can put them in a little bag and keep them from the valley there. So it's just an interesting, so kind of keep that.
What did you say about Gath?
Gath is where Goliath is from.
Goliath
is going to be from. So let's see. Should I do this now, or I'll go ahead since we're already here looking at it. 2 Samuel 21. That's a long ways from where we're going to be. This is the 2nd book of Samuel, and it's talking about the people who were the brothers of at least one of them for sure, and probably likely the others also. Let's just read it. It says, "Now it happened afterward that there was again a battle with the Philistines at Gob. Then Sibbecai the Heshite killed Saph, who was one of the sons of the giant. Again there was a war at Gob with the Philistines, where Elhanan the son of Jeri or Grim the Bethlehemite killed the brother of Goliath, the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam." We read that today, so we're talking about the same Goliath. "Yet again there was a war at Gath, and there was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each of his hands, and 6 toes on each of his feet, 24 in number, and also was born to the giant." He also was born to the giant. "So when he defied Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimea, David's brother, killed him." So this would have been David's nephew. "These 4 were born to the giant in Gath and fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants." So this is some background information on Goliath, his people, where he came from. They come from evidently a very large family, and one in particular had 6 fingers and 6 toes. So I think it's funny. He says 24 in all, 6 on all 4. So just an interesting group. They were well known. So you might say, well, where did these people come from? How do they come about? There's some different opinions on how that is, but I've included in your packet another information that talks about the Anakites, or the Anakites. They're called the Anakim, and it talks about them here, first mentioned in Deuteronomy. You remember when Moses sent Joshua out to go and spy on the people in Canaan. He sends him and the spies out, and they come back and they say, "We're like little grasshoppers. They're so big. They're like giants over there." Sometimes you hear people say, "Why would they come back with such a lie?" Well, you know what? This is where the Anakim lived, and they were a large group of people. And so it could very likely be that they were, they come from this race. So they would have been a large group of people. So during the conquest of Canaan, Joshua expelled the Anakim from the hill country, and Caleb finally drove them out of Hebron completely. However, a small remnant found a refuge in the cities of Gaza, Gath, that's where the city that we're talking about today, and Ashdod. Many biblical scholars speculate that Anakim's descendants were the Philistine giants that David encountered, including Goliath of Gath. And so there's some good information that probably leads us to believe that they come from that background. All right, so let's just look at starting with verse 1. "The Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and they were gathered at Sukkot, which belongs to Judah, and they encamped between Sukkot and Azekah, and Ephes Dammim." And so that's pretty easy. You've got 2 armies. that are just getting ready to go into battle. Each one of them is going to be on a mountain area, and there's going to be this valley of Elah in the middle where they would normally come out and have their battle. 2, and Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side with that valley of Elah in between them. So it's just setting a picture for how this would have been. 4, and a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. So there's a little bit of information here. First of all, you notice the term used, champion. Champion actually means in the Hebrew the man in the middle, the go-between man. So it's the one who is going to go between two others. So Goliath is the champion. Who is he going in between? He is representing the Philistines against the Israelites. He's the one in the middle that they have put out there. So that's why the term champion is used. Man in the between is the actual terminology. From the camp of the Philistines named Goliath, his height was 6 cubits and a span. If you remember from Exodus, we talked about cubits. There were 2 types. There was the normal cubit, which is supposed to be from the fingertips to the end of the elbow. That's going to vary. Mine is smaller than my husband's because he's a lot bigger than me. But traditionally, it was roughly 18 inches long is the cubit. Now there's the temple cubit, which is a little bit longer, but that's not what we're talking about here. When we were in Exodus, we talked about the temple cubit being a little bit longer. In this particular case, they're talking about the regular cubit, 18 inches, and a span. A span is half a cubit. So that's a little bit over half a cubit, really, because it's going to be about, well, no, that would be exactly half, 9 inches. And so if it is 6 cubits and a span, then he is 9.5 feet tall. Now, I'm just going to throw this out there to you because some of our earliest manuscripts, including the ones that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, say that he was 4 cubits and a span. That's the earliest ones that we have found, which would make him a great deal smaller. He would have been more about 6.5 feet tall, which, keep in mind, would have been large for this time. The average man is about 5.5 feet tall at this point. That doesn't make him a giant necessarily. It makes him a really tall man. I'm only throwing that out there to you because with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1940 something, people began to rethink a little bit of this. It doesn't really matter. Goliath was a big guy. He was a very big guy because of the armor that he is going to tote around on his back, which we're going to talk about. So if we were to take this information and 6 cubits in a span, then he's about 9.5 feet tall there. He had a bronze helmet on his head. Remember, what did we talk about with the Philistines? They are the only ones who know how to work with iron. And so they certainly used it to their benefit. A brass or bronze helmet on his head. And they say that the helmets had a piece that would normally come down into the face as have like a visor thing, which makes this all the more amazing. How his was made, we really don't know. Whether there was just a section that was open and there were pieces of it, we don't really know. But he had a definite brass armor helmet on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail. We know what that is. A coat of mail is that layered crocodile-looking type of mesh stuff that you wear. He would have had that on. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. They estimate that to be roughly 150 pounds. So think about wearing a coat of armor that is about 150 pounds. That's a lot to tote around.
So it's that iron-looking
meshy stuff. Yes,
okay.
Yes, that's what mail is. Yeah. And he had bronze armor on his legs, so he had leg protection. and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam. That's a little bit harder for me to really explain, to know what that is. I know that when the weavers would have the large beams that they would use like on the looms, that they would have those large beams. So I never thought they were that large, but evidently they were, because this is a pretty large spearhead. Or a large spear, and his iron spearhead that was on the top of that weighed 600 shekels. So that alone was about 20 pounds.
So how much does the shekel weigh?
Well, I don't know exactly how much a shekel weighs. All I did was translate. I know that 600 shekels was 20 pounds.
Oh, okay.
600 shekels is 20 pounds, and 5,000 shekels is 150 pounds, approximately. And the shield bearer went before him. Now the term used here is Tziah, T-Z-I-A-H, and it doesn't mean the shield that is normally used. It's not the word that's normally used if you were to have a shield. This is talking about a full body shield. So this is a very large item. And one of the things, I don't think that I really ever thought about this until I was looking at it again this week, is the idea that he had an armor bearer that went before him carrying this large shield. You don't see that on any pictures that you ever look at with Goliath. You don't know that there was another man, another Philistine, who was carrying a full-body shield out in front of him. That's not really ever discussed.
That poor little guy.
And that little feller had a hard job. He had to carry around a 20-pound shield protecting Goliath. And he stood and he cried out to the armies of Israel, and he said to them, "Why have you come out to line up for battle?" Don't you just imagine he had this deep, resounding voice? Remember, they're on separate mountains with a valley in between them. Acoustically, I guess that's a good place, but still, your voice is going to have to be really booming at some point, unless you're close enough to talk. "Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul?" I don't think he meant that in a nice way. "Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me." So what is he doing? Challenging, taunting, isn't he? "If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants." You can just imagine him going, ha ha ha, as he says that. "But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants, and you shall serve us." So he's definitely taunting the army of Israel as they wait. He's definitely throwing down the gauntlet or the challenge. And the Philistine said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." Come on, bring it on, bring it out. That's going to set the stage as David comes. "When Saul and all of Israel heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and they were greatly afraid." So he sets, in this particular verse, he sets Saul aside. He says, Saul, when Saul heard this, and when the army heard this, they were dismayed and they were afraid. Now, would that be a human feeling to have? I think it would, wouldn't it?
Natural.
That would be in the natural flesh. When you look upon this man, if he's 9.5 feet tall with all the armor that we just talked about, the loud booming voice, and he is taunting and throwing down a challenge, yeah, I can see where you are going to be afraid. What would Saul normally, how would you think that a leader would respond to that? A good leader.
Respond to his challenge. Send me out a man.
Send out many more men.
Don't you think that Saul would look at himself first as the leader when the buck stops here sort of theory? What do we know about Saul? He was tall, dark, and handsome. He was, what did it, in our first chapter, what did it say? He was from the shoulders up, taller than the rest of his people. If you're going to look around for the biggest guy to send out there, who is it going to be? Don't you imagine that everybody in the army is kind of going like this? It's him, but they're not going to say anything, and Saul's probably going,
Hey, we wanted a king to lead us in
Yeah.
battle. Come on.
yeah,
Oh, really?
do your thing.
But he had never stepped up, so
No.
this probably wasn't a surprise to
He
them at all.
did not, and so they're dismayed and they are greatly afraid, which doesn't show a whole lot of courage, nor does it show a whole lot of faith. Exactly.
But he
So
no longer has the anointing on him.
that's exactly right. He no longer has the Spirit of the Lord upon him. Now, and at this point, remember, it is amazing to me to remember that Samuel has told him, the Lord has rejected you from being the king. He's got that on him too. You would almost think that he would be more inclined to go out and fight this battle to show that he could be
Or
a
repent.
good king.
Right.
Yeah,
Start
or repent and say,
repenting.
man,
Yeah,
I have
that's
made
what
a mistake, Lord. Give, like Samson did. Remember Samson at the end? He said he was chained in between those two pillars. He had been blinded by the Philistines, and he said, Lord, give me one more moment of courage that I may bring down this temple upon these people. And God did. He died in the midst of it, but he had that moment of glory where he was able to shine there. You would think Saul might be looking for something similar to that. But, verse 12, now David was the son of the Ephraite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and who had 8 sons. And the man was old, advanced in years, in the days of Saul. Now the 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul into battle, so they're in the military. The names of the 3 sons who went into the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. Isn't it funny, because we just read in the previous chapter, those are the 3 that are mentioned previously also. You'll find that oftentimes in writings is that when there's a long list of genealogy in Hebrew writing, there may be 8 sons, and only a few are mentioned. It's because those few are the only ones that we have any record of, that did anything that were important enough to be mentioned. And sometimes it can be very confusing when you go back and do genealogy, because the others aren't talked about and they're not given a name. So there's only 3 or 4 names out of 10 sons. That can be really confusing. But we do know that these 3 were mentioned earlier as Samuel went and looked and said, is it this one, Lord? And they said no. And so now here they are mentioned again, being in the military with Saul. David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep in Bethlehem. So remember, he is soothing Saul with his musical instrument. And so where is Saul? Saul's in battle. So David certainly doesn't need to be at the castle, at the palace when Saul is in battle. And so it says that he came and went. He didn't stay there all of the time. And so he would go back to Bethlehem. And when he goes to Bethlehem, what was his job in his family?
Feed the sheep.
He was the sheep herder, wasn't he? And so he would go back and do that. And the Philistine drew near and presented himself, look at this, 40 days, morning and evening. So for 40 days, Goliath has been out there taunting Israel every morning and every evening. I find that amazing because, the Jewish people, when the temple comes, they had a time every morning and a time every evening where they met with the Lord in the Lord. And here we see a time when Goliath comes out in the morning and in the evening, and he's defying the armies of the Lord. And twice a day, they sit there and they take it. It's also interesting that 40 is often used in the Bible as a time of testing. We see that. 40 is a number of testing in the Bible, and we do see that. And Jesse said to his son David, take now your brothers an ephah of dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp, and carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them. So, typical father, right? He says, okay, it must have been very traditional during those times that when it was close enough that you would take supplies out to the armies. And so he's taking out special treats of loaves and cheeses, some to be given to the captains who were in charge of his sons, and the bread to be the supplies to be given to the army, and see how your brothers fare and bring back news. He wants to know how his sons are doing. It's pretty incredible too that David has the freedom, this is just how it was, to run out to battle, to go out. I mean, we think about how military wars are done now. We're certainly not going to run over to Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever our battles are and check things out. It seems unlikely, but at this point you can just run up to the battle and see how everybody's doing. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. So David rose early in the morning. Now, underline this, please, because you're going to need it later. Left the sheep with a keeper, and took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to fight and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. But actually, they really hadn't gone army against army yet. For 40 days, they're just sitting there listening to Goliath taunt them and say that he defies the armies of Israel. So they haven't really done anything at this point. They're all just standing around looking at it. And David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper. So whoever it was that kept all the supplies for the army, ran to the army and came and greeted his brothers. So he goes up to the front lines where his brothers are kept, and he runs up and he goes, hey, hi, how's it going? Then as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines. And he spoke according to the same words. So he's saying the same things that we've just read. But this time it's different because David heard him. That had not happened before. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him, and they were dreadfully afraid. This does not look well for the IDF. This just doesn't look good for Israel at the moment. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. So it appears that this is something that Saul has promised. The word has gotten out there in the army that if you go up and fight Goliath, I'll give you my daughter, which will make you what? A prince in the nation, right? I'll give you my daughter. I'll give you great riches. And from taxes is added in there. It's in italics. You can see that. When it says, I will and give his father's house exemption, I went back and did a little research into that, and taxes is certainly one of the things you would be exempted from. The other would be from any military service. So you would not be forced to give your sons to any sort of military service. So it's really a pretty great reward that you would have, especially if you have 8 sons, right? To not have to have them go up there. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him and said, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? Okay, so he's asking what's going to be done? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Now there you go. That's the right answer. That's what you want to hear. Who is this? What would be in a Jewish mindset kind of the nastiest thing you could call them? The uncircumcised. They are not part of the covenant. They are not in the community. They are not holy. They are not God's people. You know, this is the uncircumcised Philistine. And what is he most angry about? that he would do what?
Defy
The armies of the living God. So Israel is the army of the living God. It's not the men necessarily.
God.
It's the God who they represent. And they've forgotten that. They had forgotten that they are the army of the living God. At this point, these are soldiers of Saul. That doesn't give you a lot of comfort. That doesn't give you a lot of strength. When you are tied to a man who doesn't represent any of the characteristics, who doesn't have the anointing, who's not showing up, and you're tied to that, it doesn't give you a lot of courage. But when you are the army of the living God, when you belong to God, that's where your courage comes from. That's what happens. And the people answered him in this manner, saying, so it shall be done for the man who kills him. So they're just reiterating, yep, that's exactly what's going to happen, all the things we just talked about. So Eliab, the oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David. Okay, this is the oldest brother and the baby brother. And he said, why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. So, here's an indication that I don't believe that Eliab has any idea that David has been anointed for the position that he's been anointed.
No.
Sounds like he's jealous of
He's
him too.
very upset.
That he left the
So let's stop and talk about that. First of all, he says, what did you do with those few little sheep that Dad put you in charge of? All you got to do is take care of those few little sheep. What does it say earlier? I ask you to underline an important thing in verse 20. What did David do? He arose early in the morning and he left the sheep with a keeper. David's responsible. David didn't just walk off from the job that he had. He found a keeper for the sheep. He made sure they were well taken care of. He did not leave them in any sort of danger. And yet his brother says, who in the world did you leave them with? Did you just go off? Do you really think that's why Eliab is mad? Probably not.
I think he's being protected.
He's mad because David is what?
Cowards and David's being brave.
David is seeing that. Eliab, if you look back, and that is described as being tall.
Dark and handsome.
He's tall, remember? Samuel sees him and sees that he's tall and handsome, and he says, surely, ooh, this must be the one. Do you think Eliab might be feeling a little bit of pressure that he's not going out as one of the biggest guys in the army?
He's making him look bad.
He's making him look bad, isn't he?
Yeah.
Here comes his little
Brother.
elfish brother and a little bright-eyed boy, and he is he's making him look bad. He says, I know the pride and insolence of your heart. I don't think Eliab knows David's heart at all. He says, you've come down here because you're curious and you want to see action. Not that you'll be part of any of it, but you want to see it. You want to see a battle, don't you, David? So, David says, what have I done now? That kind of seems like a typical little brother response.
Yeah.
Like, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? So I was thinking about that, and I think probably what he's saying is, do I not have good reason to ask this? But I also was thinking about it, and I thought, from what I can see here, David is the first one who rightly understands that there is a cause. The cause is he is defying the army of the living God. That's the cause. Because when you defile the army of the living God, you defile God. When you defile the people of the living God, you defile God. So there is a cause here that David is seeing. David is seeing it from a godly perspective of the fact that this is a defiance of God. We can't let this stand. The people before that were simply trembling in fear because none of them would go out and take care of it. Then he turned from him toward another and said the same thing, and the people answered him as the first one did. So he's asking affirmation. I'm sure David is saying, is that what they're going to give to this? Who's willing to do this? Who's going to take care of this man? And David's, wait a second, I went that. And 31. Now when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. So what are the words that David spoke that get reported to Saul? Who is going to take care of this uncircumcised man who dares to come and defy the army of the living God? And so immediately the people went, Saul needs to know about this. They run up and they tell Saul. And Saul says, well, bring him here. Then David said to Saul, let no man's heart fall because of him. Who's the him? Fail. Because of him. Who's the him? Goliath. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. So don't be dismayed. Hey, don't even worry about it. I've got this. I will go up and fight. So picture this for a minute. Here's this young man, barely in his teens, coming up, standing before Saul and saying, hey, I got this. You don't even worry about it. Can you imagine what Saul must be thinking?
Well, and his brothers.
He's got his brothers standing around there. What they're thinking. 33, and Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth. So he's going, David, you're a young guy. This guy has been fighting longer than you've been alive. He's been a mighty warrior. It's funny he didn't say he's also 9.5 feet tall and has this armor on. He didn't mention that. He just said, you're young, and he's been fighting longer than you've been alive. And David said to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep. And when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. So he's telling him, let me tell you how I have been prepared for this moment. God, you know, I was thinking about it and I thought, when he goes through this experience, when David actually did this, he would have had no idea at that time that God was preparing him for this moment and for the future ministry that he would have had. But God knew. And so it's that perfect example of everything that we go through in preparation is for a moment to come. We just don't know when that moment is. Sometimes it's really hard stuff and we don't even recognize that we're being prepared for a future moment. But this is a beautiful example of that. He's a shepherd. It's very natural that when predators come, that they fight against them. But I wonder how many shepherd boys fought a lion. How many shepherd boys fought a bear? And literally took the lamb out of the mouth of those animals. Somehow David, from the very beginning, was being prepared in a way that seems to be almost supernatural for a moment like this. And when so I went out and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard. That would be the lamb, and struck it and killed it. Or the lion. The lion, not the lamb. And struck it and killed it. So he's even giving more details about how amazing this was. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them. Why? Seeing that he has defiled the armies of the living God. Defied, sorry. I'm really messing up. I think I'm jumping ahead. Seeing that he has defied the armies of the living God. So this is past what I've done, bringing it into, and now here's the present and the future of what's going to be accomplished. Moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. So 9 foot tall with a huge military spear, javelin, all the things and all of that. When you stop and think about it, David, even younger than he is now, maybe 13 years old, fighting against a bear, is it really all that much different? A young boy going up against a lion or a bear? It takes that same courage and that same faith that God will deliver. He gives all the praise to God. He delivered me from the paw of the lion. He delivered me from the paw of the bear. And this same one will deliver me from this Philistine.
This whole thing just is unbelievable that a child would have that kind of faith.
Absolutely. But remember, we just read in the previous chapter that from that day forward of his anointing, the Spirit of the Lord fell on David. So Saul, he must have presented a pretty good case, because Saul says to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head, and he also clothed him with a coat of mail. So remember earlier we had read that although the Israeli army didn't have any type of armor or much weaponry, Saul and Jonathan did. So Saul thinks, okay, well, if I'm going to send this kid out there, I'm going to at least give him all of my stuff. But Saul is tall, dark, and handsome, big guy, right? So his armor fits him, right? It doesn't fit a young guy. David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them." So David took them off. Did God need for David to have armor on? No, it was ridiculous, and that whole picture is really kind of funny when you stop. When you think about David, when you think about it, you think about a young child wearing his grandfather's suit, everything too long, dragging, not being able to move with it. That's how David looked, and God didn't need David to be clothed in any of that. 40. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook. And he put them in a shepherd's bag in a pouch, which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. So there are 2 traditions that are out there about this particular verse. One of them is from a Jewish perspective. I'll tell you what the Jewish rabbis teach on this. They teach that the 5 stones in the brook, God miraculously caused to sing out, "Choose us, for one of us will take down Goliath." That's what they teach. And so it's a tradition. So you can just imagine that, but that's what they teach, is that they cry out to that. The one that we teach in Christianity is the reason why he selected 5 stones is because we just read earlier when we started out, Goliath has brothers. How many brothers? 4. So the teaching in our tradition in Christianity is 5 stones for Goliath and his 4 brothers. That's every bit as much a tradition as the 5 stones in the brook, because 1, we have no indication that the brothers are there. We don't know. They may be, but we don't know. We have no indication that David knows anything about them. Maybe, but we have no indication of that. We have no belief that David thinks he's going to fight 5 giants. It's as much a tradition to teach as it is the 5 stones singing out from the brook. The problem is we can look at that and it's very interesting. I find it interesting that they teach that they sing from the brook. But you can't teach that. I'm sure
Not biblical.
the reason I think it's interesting to put 5 brothers and 5 stones together is it helps you remember that Goliath had 4 brothers. That's the only reason I like to remember it. It helps me remember that. But we have no reason to believe that he did that. He picked 5 stones. Why? We really don't know why. Perhaps he thought when he slew Goliath that there were going to be people coming down after him. Who knows? Who knows why David would do that? But it certainly isn't as some people teach, because Goliath had 4 other brothers that he chose 5 stones. So he draws near to the Philistine. 41. So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David. So they're pulling closer and closer. And the man who bore the shield went before him. Here's that armor bearer that carries that 20-pound shield walking before Goliath. So with all that Goliath has on, boy, he has a full-body shield in front of him. He's pretty well protected, isn't he? And David is standing there in some sort of little day outfit, shepherd outfit that he has on, much smaller, of course, and without all of that. 42, and when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good looking. Well, that needs no explanation. Of course, he's going to say, are you kidding me? That's the best that you can do. So the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. I was reading this week where it was talking about this is really probably much worse than it sounds. We take it to mean, am I a dog and you little with your little sticks? But the term that's used here for dog is a term that's used several other places that talks about homosexuality behavior, male promiscuity, homosexuality behavior, and so it's a terminology that would be an emasculation of Goliath. That terminology of saying, you think I'm that, and so you send me this little guy? Somehow thinking that he's emasculated, which would also be an explanation about why he would curse David with his gods, because he's taking it as a direct insult that someone like that would come against someone like him. So he's not just talking about the little four-legged arf kind of dog.
Like you're calling me a sissy.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And the Philistine said to David, come to me and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin. So he's fully armed, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. This day the Lord defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth. Why? So that all of the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. So David is doing this for the right purposes. This is the cause that was talked about earlier. This is what is motivating him. His faith and the knowledge is that the Lord is going to deliver you. He goes a step further and says, I'm going to cut your head off too, by the way. And he says, I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines. So when I do that, then we're going to come and take the whole army. So he's making quite the threat. Why? Because when that's done, they're going to know that there is a God in Israel. Then all of this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. God does not need weapons. God does not need his warrior to be clothed in battle. I think when he says, for all of the assembly shall know, at that point he's talking about all of the Israeli soldiers also. They all need to know that it doesn't matter what kind of weaponry you have. God doesn't need the weaponry. They needed to be reminded of it just as much as the Philistines needed to be told. So it was when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistines. No fear there. David put his hand in his bag and he took out a stone and he slung it and he struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead and he fell on his face to the earth. So however it got around that helmet, it did, went right into the forehead. Now it's interesting to me that when the stone hits, you would think it would have knocked him backwards. The projectile of that would have knocked him backwards. But it says he fell forward. So stunned him and he fell forward. But if you remember earlier, we also read about the statue of Dagon, which is the god of the Philistines, that fell forward on his face. Just an interesting little thing that he falls forward on his face to the earth. So David prevailed against the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Now it's going to talk, it says it struck him with a stone and it killed him, but he did kill him. He's going to kill him with a secondary thing that he does there. There was no sword in the hand of David. Now, therefore, David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword, so the Philistine sword, and drew it out of its sheath, and there he kills him. So whether he's knocked unconscious or whatever happens, David then goes over and finishes the job by taking his own sword out of the sheath. I mean, that's pretty humiliating to be killed by your own sword, if you're a warrior and a Philistine, and drew it out and killed him and cut off his head with it. Oh my, that had to be horribly gory. That sword was huge, the head was huge, and David's pretty small. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. So that man that's standing in the middle for them is gone, and all of their fear comes out. Now, you would think that the Philistines would still think that they had a chance. For whatever reason, they don't. They flee. Yep. Now the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted. Oh, now they're going to arise. Here they go, getting brave again. And pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley and the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to Shaaraim and as far as Gath and Ekron. So they're wounded, they're falling, they're fleeing. It's not good for them. Then the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their tents. So everything David said is true. He said, "No, I'm gonna kill you. I'm gonna take off your head, and I'm gonna run the army out." And everything that he said is true. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. Okay, so I thought about that too, and I thought that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because right now Jerusalem is a Jebusite city. It's not got anything to do with David right now. Jerusalem isn't an important city to Israel yet. It's a Jebusite city, and so it isn't important now. And now we're going to read as we go down that he's actually going to present the head to Saul here. So what I believe that this is saying is that at a certain point, David is going to take the head to Jerusalem, because there is coming a time where Jerusalem is going to be important to David. The city is going to belong to David. And so when that happens, he brings the head of Goliath to the city at that time. But here's the thing, that's years down the road.
How long is he going to
That is it. So what I believe they did is they do that sort of like pickling, mummified sort of thing with the head. It becomes a sort of trophy for him. You would hope not, but he has it somewhere, and it's an important enough thing that he brings it to Jerusalem when Jerusalem becomes important. And so it's kind of a weird thing to think about, isn't it? But he put his armor, whose armor? Goliath's armor, that big 150-pound armor suit, which probably weighed far more than David did, into his tent. When Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is this youth?" And Abner said, "As your soul lives, O king, I do not know." So the king said, "Well, inquire whose son this young man is." So you were asking earlier, why does he not recognize him? But see the question for what it is. The question is not, who is this?
The father.
Yeah.
He's saying,
who's his father?
Who's his father? Who does this guy belong to? Okay, one, the family goods are going to be exempt from taxes and military service if the promises come true, right? Also, I mean, it's important to know the genealogy. It's important to know who belongs to who in this nation. And so he wants to know, whose son is this? Who's the man who sired David? Then as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. So he comes to David wagging that big, bloody head of Goliath. And Saul said to him, this would not be my first question, but said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" So once again, he's asking, who's your father? Who do you belong to? What family are you from? And David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite." So we know that the sword of David is eventually going to be, the sword of David, but it's Goliath. Goliath's sword, that big one that he cuts his head off with, is eventually going to be placed in the tabernacle in Nob. When we get to that story, he's going to use it again at another time. We're going to see David use that sword in a really amazing, funny, particular way. He's going to use that sword. So he keeps the armor. He keeps the sword, it's going to be used eventually, and he keeps
The head.
the head
Did you say
of
tabernacle?
Goliath. It's going to be in the tabernacle in Nob eventually. That's not told here, but I'm just telling you that that's where it is. And then he keeps the armor in his tent. All right, so that's the story of David and Goliath.